Okay, the final point that you included in your letter was about polygamy and polyandry. Why don't you go ahead and talk to us about what points you were making there?
Well, Joseph Smith had at least 34 wives. But what really, and I always thought that Joseph Smith may have practiced polygamy. I mean, I knew it was a big thing with Brigham Young and a few prophets after that, but I didn't know how big it was with Joseph Smith. And so as I started looking into it and realizing that he had that many polygamous wives, and then seeing him constantly covering it up and lying about it, it wasn't something that he was owning, and so that was a red flag for me. But probably the biggest thing was when I learned about polyandry. I had never even heard of that word before. I'd never heard it spoken in church. And I actually had to look up the definition, but what it is a man that marries another man's wife. And so Joseph Smith had 11, I believe, polyandrous marriages as well. And several of those were to priesthood holding men. And so when I was a missionary, I would talk about polygamy, very quickly, dismiss it, say it's not something we, practice anymore. It was something that we were using in the beginning of the church because of persecution. We needed to really quickly be able to populate an area, or it was to help out, elderly women, and maybe even people that never got married, help them with a sealing ordinance. That was my always thing. But how am I supposed to justify the polyandry? Like, how could I ever explain to somebody the purpose for that?
Yeah. And so Grove's response, he basically kind of pulls his church historian, Joseph Smith Papers Project card. He basically, oversaw the creation of the essays and the editorial process. He oversees the Joseph Smith Papers Project. And he says to you, and I believe he's sincere, right? But
right.
He basically, and it was kind of sweet. He basically said, I've spent the last 6 years reading pretty much everything that Joseph Smith ever wrote. And I've come to, you say you've come to detest him, or whatever word it was you used to say, you just stopped liking Joseph Smith, basically. You saw him in a bad light. Basically, Gross says, the more I read about Joseph, the more I come to like him better. So that was what did you think about that?
Well, thinking about it after, it kind of made sense to me, actually, because I've been studying so much on Joseph Smith's life and his actions, right? And where Matt is talking about his writings. So I think we're talking about two different things. I had always looked at Joseph Smith's writings, and so of course I praised the man. Everything he said was beautiful and brilliant and happy and good. But when I actually started looking at him as a person, his actions, what he was actually doing, that's when his character was defiled to me. And so we were kind of talking about two different things, I think.
Right. Not his writings, but his behavior.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I mean, Joseph Smith deceived people about treasure digging. He deceived people about the Kirtland Bank and people lost their fortunes. He deceived people about translating ancient records. He lied to his own wife that he was practicing polygamy, and he hid it from her, which violates the text of D&C 132, by the way, because the wife is supposed to be able to approve any subsequent wives that get taken.
Well, yeah, and D&C 132-63 goes especially against polyandry.
Yeah, and he's taking on other people's wives. He's sending people on missions and then propositioning their wives while the men are away on missions that he sent them on. And then he's actually propositioning 14, 15, 16-year-olds with this massive abuse of power that's predatory, inappropriate for young girls. Any of us by any standard today would kill or throw someone in jail for doing the types of things to our daughters that Joseph Smith did to other people's daughters. And then he would threaten them. He would say, I'll coerce you. if you become my plural wife, then you and your whole family will be sealed in the celestial kingdom with me. But if you do not accept plural marriage with me, you and all your family will be condemned. And then if any possible plural wife disagreed to be Joseph's plural wife, then he would actually, and spoke about it publicly, he would malign them as whores in the newspaper. And then, of course, when William Law tells the world, I was in the first presidency, Joseph's lying about polygamy, I saw him practicing polygamy, I know he's doing it, then Joseph calls him a liar and destroys the printing press and tries to destroy all the evidence that was made. How can Grow or anyone say, oh my gosh, I think Joseph, he was a good man. The more I read about Joseph Smith, the more I love him. Those are the acts of a charlatan. Those are the acts of somebody who is predatory and abusing their power. And I was really sad. There were probably 2 people that canceled, their donations to Mormon Stories as a result of our previous episodes. More people gave money than took money away. So none of our decisions were about the money. But I did think to myself, for the people that canceled their donations, I thought, interesting. You'll give 10% of your income to a church whose prophet has done all these heinous things, including abusing children, lying to their wife, embezzling people's money. You'll keep giving 10% to that organization that has policies that cause young LGBT Mormons to kill themselves, and that actually causes marriages to unravel and children to be torn from their parents. You'll keep donating to that organization. But if on Mormon Stories we share the recording of a general authority, you'll cancel your donations because that's beyond the pale. I just kind of question the values and the priorities of the people that would make that decision.
John, did you see what was happening when we were talking about Joseph Smith's character, right? And how they're so quick to justify everything he's done, but never with Jeremy Runnels, right?
Yeah.
And how can they look at this as okay? I just don't understand it. The magnifying glass that they're putting these people under. I mean, you would think that you would need a more powerful magnifying glass when you're talking about a prophet.
Yeah.
But they let these things slide and they justify things like, well, we don't know if, really, if the polyandrous marriages were sexual in nature, right? We don't know that. And it's like, well, I never really write down in my journal, like, man, had some great sex last night, that's not something that's really talked about. I mean, so yeah, we don't know these things, but the fact that they were going on and with very young girls, that's the problem, is that this is ruining people's lives. This is a great point, because stuff like this still happens today, and he uses an example where he says, well, there's a story of a man, he was 31, back in 1840, and he marries a 15-year-old girl. And although maybe some eyebrows were raised or whatever, it was a fine thing to happen, because back then it was a different time. Well, first of all, it was still a big deal, okay, to marry somebody that's that young. But the biggest difference between that story and a Joseph Smith story is that they fell in love, and they both consensually decided to get married out of love.
And it wasn't illegal.
And right. And
it
Joseph
wasn't coercive.
Smith, right. It wasn't divisive. Joseph Smith, on the other hand, he's talking to these poor girls, and he's giving them stories like, and I know that, these stories were told to different individuals, but the story that was going on was, that either I promise your entire family with salvation, right? Blessing her and her entire family with eternal salvation if she does it. Or if she doesn't, there's an angel with a flaming sword that will kill Joseph, right? And so to put these people in this situation, like, what do you expect them to do? And these kids are so young. Why get married to them? They have their whole lives to find a priesthood holding man. I can't get over it. I can't get over that.
And just to recount Grove's responses to the polygamy, again, it was the incredibly shrinking narrative. He's like, we don't really have journal writings of women contemporary to the actual time and events where they say, I had sex with Joseph today. Of course, they're married to other men. Are they going to be writing down in their journal, I'm married to this other guy. Hey, but today I had great sex with Joseph. That would be kind of a dumb thing to do. I'm sure Joseph, because we know Joseph and others were lying about it, of course, Joseph's going to tell them, don't write about this stuff. So that's kind of a weird argument. Again, Grow wanted to say, we don't have any contemporary evidence. We just have recollections that were written down or testified to decades later. But again, this is the point Lindsay Hansen Park made. When it's something like the priesthood restoration, which we have no contemporary evidence for, the Melchizedek priesthood, I'm not even sure about the Aaronic priesthood, we're still willing to sort of base our entire authority as a church on these happenings that weren't written down until what, 5, 7, 8 years later. That's, in that case, we'll cherry pick and use the evidence in our favor. But if these women claim decades later to have had sex with Joseph Smith, oh, well, it was written too far later, it wasn't contemporary, we need to kind of discredit. Again, expecting that people are going to be writing about their sex at all in their journals.
Well, it's a double standard. It comes down to the convenience.
With apologists, it always is. Then he goes on, he talks about Nauvoo, there's no records, it's all reflections. And then he does the typical sort of, who's the guy, Brian Hale's sort of, we don't have any evidence of sexual polyandry, it's just sealings. And you guys got into a discussion about whether or not Brigham Young was polyandrous. And again, he used Andrew Jackson as an example of someone who married someone who wasn't divorced yet, which he said was a scandal. But I think that's a bad example, comparing that to Joseph, to say Andrew Jackson married a woman who couldn't get a divorce in a way to justify Joseph's polyandry, marrying women who were married to men that they lived with.
Well, and he admitted the fact that that was not going on with Joseph Smith too. He used that to justify Brigham Young, but he, you know what I mean? He very, very much stated that that was not the case with Joseph Smith. Like,
that's fine. It's just always shrinking. So he basically lays out three possibilities. Again, this is the plausible deniability approach. There's no number one is these weren't traditional marriages. That's the first possibility for polyandry, that there was no sex, that there wasn't financial support. So the polyandrous marriages are okay because they weren't traditional marriages. That was the first point that Grow made. The second was maybe they were just sealings. Maybe it was just about the dynastic sealings in the future, and it really wasn't about marriage in this life. And then the third is most women that were in polyandrous relationships were not married to righteous priesthood holders, and it could have been these women wanting to access the blessings of heaven. And again, is that really what God is going to require? Is that, oh my gosh, I'm not married to a righteous priesthood holder, so let me scramble and get married to Joseph Smith before he dies, because otherwise I'm screwed in heaven, right?
Isn't that what temple work is for?
Exactly.
And also the millennium.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is where at the 1 hour mark, you make this beautiful point, which is, this is my biggest problem, is that religion can be used to justify horrible things. And you talk about, Muslims that, sort of radical Muslims that kill people, jihad. You mentioned Nephi cutting off Laban's head. And you're basically saying it's unacceptable, the level of pain and suffering that religion can cause.
Religion obviously can be very dangerous. When my God says something that's against what your God says, what does that create? These are not ideas. These are higher than us. These are as profound belief and conviction can get. That's where war breaks out. Not, between nations or between people. Does that make sense?
Totally.
It's scary, and it can be dangerous. And this is an absolutely perfect example of that, of justifying certain things because God said it was okay. And then one thing I want to make sure that we don't forget is when we talked about Brigham Young, because I said, well, I remember Elder Clarke chimed in here and he says, well, none of us like the idea of polygamy. Sister Clarke, absolutely hates the idea of, of polygamy. And I say something along the lines of, well, it's too bad that in order for us to reach the highest, glory of the celestial kingdom, we all have to be polygamists. And Matt Groh goes on to say, well, that was never taught. That was actually never really taught. And I said, well, Brigham Young says in Journal of Discourses that the only men who become gods, even the sons of God, are those who enter into polygamy. And what was really interesting there, and I know you caught this as well, but it was this whole, oh, well, we can't hang our hat on every little thing that Brigham Young says. Kind of like, oh, that cute little prophet saying all these stupid stuff. Just, like discounting the fact that we have Brigham Young University, like Brigham Young was a big deal. And to just write off what other prophets have said if they contradict what we're teaching now, I don't think we can do that or should be able to do that.
For sure. It's sort of like ignore the past prophets. How do you know if a prophet's telling the truth? He's alive and his mouth is moving. Otherwise, anything a prophet said is fair game to be undermined at any time. And anyone with a brain is going to say, well, if I can't trust Joseph Smith or Brigham Young or John Taylor, how can I trust Thomas S. Monson today? But they don't want to talk about that. And it's just not consistent. I'll just quickly add that, yeah, it was interesting. The Grohl was like, well, those utterances that polygamy was required to be exalted in the highest degree was just during this small time when the church was being persecuted, right around right before the manifesto was written. But Lindsay Hansen Clarke, makes it very clear that this was a very significant and prevailing narrative for many, many, many years. She says there's a reason why there's 3 degrees in the celestial kingdom. If you read Doctrine and Covenants 132, it's called what? The new and everlasting covenant of plural marriage. So to say now that it's some small, obscure, minimal thing, I think, comes across as disingenuous. All right. So yeah, he talked about that aristocrat that married his cousin. He talked about the angel and the flaming sword. And then it was kind of interesting. It seemed like he was saying that angel with the flaming sword happened with Zina, who was in her 20s, not with the teenager. And again, is it less abusive for God to send an angel and a flaming sword if Joseph is threatening, someone in their 20s than if they're a teenager? That was just kind of a weird justification, I felt like.
Well, and if he's telling one person that, I doubt he's, filtering it for the 14-year-olds. But again, that's speculation. That's, but I'm just saying that was a story that was being shared, throughout a lot of his plural marriages.
Yeah. Then the conversation basically went to, again, dismantling what Brigham Young said because they had a different style in General Conference, that there was a lot of speculation. And then you speak up. How do we know, what a prophet says is true if it's always changing? And then Gross says, listen, we're all enmeshed in our culture. We're going to be racist in the 1830s. And then you point out, oh my gosh, well, our church was racist in the 1970s. And your basic point was the prophets seem to always be enmeshed in culture. When are they ever not? And I would make the point, isn't that a point of a prophet? They can transcend culture and get God's direct direction divorced from culture. Isn't that what the real value would be? But if the prophets are always 30 years behind the civil rights movements of the days, then are the prophets being prophets, or are they simply old dudes who are reactive to the courage of the civil rights leaders of their day?
Which is more likely, right? Which is more likely?
Yeah, it's like Occam's razor. What's the more simple, logical explanation?
And at this point of our conversation, it goes into kind of rapid fire mode because I had run out of time that I have with them. But there was just so many things that they had said that I had to just bring to their attention, and this is kind of where we talked really quickly about proclamation of the families. You know, we even got into City Creek and tithing and all that kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, and I just want to, this is for me one of the most important parts of the interview, because you basically say, why don't the prophets consult with God? This is just too overwhelming that we can't ever really trust what they say. That's when Clarke responds, yeah, there's always going to be tit for tat. You know, and he basically went on to say that he basically quotes Oakes when Oakes says that there will always be tit for tat. And then you're basically saying, well, then when can we ever trust that a prophet has really spoken for God? And basically this is when Clarke speaks up and says, the prophets set the direction. They set the direction for the church. And you're like, well, when have they done it? And he's like, well, eternal families. And he basically offers proclamation of the family as proof that the prophets set the direction for the church. And he called that revelation, which is really ironic because what we know about the proclamation of the family is that lawyers drafted the proclamation of the family during the time of the Hawaii same-sex marriage ruling because the church needed some document, because the Book of Mormon is silent on it, on homosexuality. Doctrine and Covenants is silent on homosexuality. We have miracle of forgiveness, but we don't have church policy around homosexuality. And so lawyers draft proclamation on the family to submit an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, so that they can have standing to oppose same-sex marriage. And now Clarke is citing that as an evidence of revelation. So again, it's the lawyers, it's Curtin and McConkie, who are the prophets, seers, and revelators, not the general authorities of the church.
Yeah, and it was
mention the fact that that document is heinous and deeply offensive to feminists, to working women, to LGBT people, to people who get same-sex married, to people who have a more progressive view of gender roles. It's a horrendous document. So it's so ironic to list that as an example of God leading prophets in just way too many ways.
And it wasn't even, he didn't say revelation, he said prophecy. And again, all of this stuff, what means what at the end of the day, right? But to me, a prophecy is something that's very divine, that's miraculous. That would be, for me, something miraculous that happens, or warning a people of something that actually comes to pass. That's why I asked what prophecies have come since Joseph, and when he pointed to the proclamation of the family, I almost felt bad that that's where he went. I was almost inside. I was like, oh no, don't go there, because I mean, like, to point to that of all things, and so I had to say something, and I mentioned that I feel that it's a very kind of homophobic document. And he responds with trying to explain, that it is prophetic. And I ask him, well, how so? And he goes on to talk about, well, the nature of the family, the importance of a husband and a wife and all this kind of stuff. And I said, well, and that's exactly the problem, is that we are getting too involved politically on these issues when I believe people are born that way and have the right to be happy. And what do we lose as a religion by allowing them to do that? I mean, we can say that it's against the religion and stuff, but to go knocking door to door and take part in this, like Proclamation 8 and Proclamation to the Family, it's really, it's taking it too far. And he responds and he says, well, Trevor, if we were all homosexuals, then this whole thing would end. And that was very revealing to me of how these men actually think. I don't know if they think it's contagious or it's genetic. I can't believe I just said it's genetic. But I'm just saying that, my response was, not everyone needs to be homosexual. People will be heterosexual, people will be homosexual, and we can live together in a world, we can love each other, and we can allow each other to be happy. And that's a point that I feel strongly on. And for him to point that the one prophecy that we've had over the past 100+ years is a proclamation to the family. That was sad for me.
Yeah. And I loved how you called it a homophobic document directly to them. He goes on, and this was another just really disappointing part from Elder Clarke. He goes on to literally make the claim that if everyone on earth were homosexuals, that this all ends, he said, meaning human existence. And I just think I'm sorry, that's one of the most dumb, ignorant statements that a person could make. It's offensive. And man, we got to pick leaders of a multinational billion-dollar corporation that are a little bit more thoughtful and sophisticated than that. Then it goes on to talk about, he basically makes the same old claim that, well, the church doesn't let single people have sex who are heterosexual, so we're being consistent by not letting homosexuals have sex or get married. And you make the very important point that, as I recall, that at least heterosexuals have the opportunity to get married and have sex, whereas homosexuals never have that opportunity. And again, Clarke falls back to saying, prophets have stated this, it's what families were made for, blah, blah, blah. You keep saying, what does it mean to be a prophet? What does it mean to be a seer and a revelator? And then he lists the Perpetual Education Fund as prophetic, as being temples dotting the world as prophetic. And again, construction projects do not equate to revelation. A construction project is when you have money and you build a building. It's not God telling you something that's going to happen in the future. The Perpetual Education Fund doesn't necessarily constitute revelation. It's like, let's have a program. Let's see if we can find a way to educate people from the third world. It's not a prophecy where you're predicting or seeing what's going to happen in the future.
Absolutely. And I have my own thoughts on temples and perpetual education. I brought them to him. How much service are we really doing with these programs? But even if they were doing good, I agree, and they are humanitarian efforts maybe, or, constructions, programs and stuff, but it's not prophecy.
Exactly.
There's a difference.
Yeah, exactly. So you guys talk about temples for a bit. You basically make the point that temples are kind of worthless if the church isn't what it claims to be. That was an interesting part of the conversation. And then as we're kind of wrapping up, you basically have Clarke asserting that the prophets do communicate with God. Grow basically saying that there's always a need for faith. Clarke reaffirms that the church gives millions of dollars a year in humanitarian aid, which there's two problems with that argument. Problem number one is it always wants credit and visibility for its humanitarian aid, which is weird because Jesus said, give your alms in private. So why is a church that follows Christ kind of bragging about their humanitarian aid? But even so, if you look at the percentage of the church's revenue that it gives to humanitarian aid, apparently it's very, very small relative to other much smaller organizations that give much larger percentages of their income to humanitarian aid.
Yeah, and that sparked for me the whole idea of tithing. Isn't the idea of tithing to give from the heart, give what you can? The fact that we can't go into the temple, we can't participate in these saving ordinances unless we are giving 10% to the church, that's as if there's an admission price to heaven. And I think there's something fundamentally wrong with that, with the principle of what tithing should actually be.
Yeah, that's totally fair. And then, ironically, right after talking about humanitarian aid, we talk about the City Creek Mall, and basically Grow and Clarke basically make the argument that was because the Salt Lake City is church headquarters. It's where the Salt Lake City Temple is. We got to build up the city. We got to make it pretty. We got to keep downtown looking beautiful, which is a fine argument, except that what is building a ornate deluxe mall with the Victoria's Secret, and a diamond store, like what does that have to do with Christianity and the messages in the Book of Mormon about fine apparel and about keeping things humble and pride it sort of falls against that. But also he throws Detroit under the bus. Basically, Clarke says, we don't want Salt Lake City looking like Detroit, which I hear Detroit's looking a lot better these days. Anyway, it's weird how Clarke continually throws Jeremy Runnels and, Detroit and non-Mormons. He's throwing everyone under the bus that he can. He's the bus thrower, basically.
Maybe Detroit's looking a little better because the church has gotten involved. I'm just kidding. No, yeah. I mean, he says, do you know what happens to city centers when we don't protect them? And I said, I don't think all city centers need a religion to build a mall, around their cathedral or temple. It's in order for the city to be clean and productive. You know what I mean? That kind of falls in the same category to me of this thought that your children cannot be safe unless they're in the church.
Yeah. Jasmine makes the point that there's no Victoria's Secret at City Creek. Heath says, I wish City Creek had a Victoria's Secret. Okay, I stand corrected. But, just go look at the list of the stores there. You make up your mind. Go read the Book of Mormon and the speeches in the Book of Mormon about fine, costly apparel, about jewelry, about, ornate appearance, and then go walk around City Mall and ask yourself, is City Mall consistent with the messages in the Book of Mormon?
It's definitely not one giant Deseret book. We'll just put it that way.
Yeah. You go on to basically say it's wrong for the church to require money to access the temple, that's messed up. Clarke responds by saying, without tithing, we'd be a bankrupt church. And basically, the way this whole conversation wraps up, Clarke basically says there's going to be more problems. There's always going to be tit for tat. He makes a reference to the Hoffman. I mean, we covered everything. He references the Hoffman records, and he basically says that Hoffman fooled a lot of people. At this point, Groh basically mentioned some historical conference that he went to where all sorts of non-Mormon historians admitted being fooled by Mark Hoffman. And Clarke makes this really hilarious and amazing and candid admission. He says, we do a lot of thinking that we don't pray over. So on the one hand, he asserts just 10 minutes earlier that prophets speak with God. And then later he says, we do a lot of thinking, and I assume acting, that we don't pray over. And so, they want to have it both ways. If the church does something right, then prophets are talking to God. If the church does something wrong, we do a lot of thinking that we don't pray over. We're just men. We're acting as men. Yeah.
Yep. And, I think a lot of people might be questioning, what was President Clarke, or what was Elder Clarke's idea of this whole meeting? What was I hoping to get out of it? You know what I mean? What were our different intentions? But I actually just read the bottom of my email, which I forgot was in my email to Elder Clarke and Matt Groh. And it says, I would be open to any information that you guys have on these topics, as I currently have an extremely open mind to any information that would better guide me. To be fair, however, I want to let you know that I am currently a disaffected member of the church, and I am looking into sharing these ideas with the public, as I wish someone would have shared them with me a long time ago. So I think it was very clear to them where I was at. There was no, misunderstanding there. And, will my relationship with Elder Clarke be changed? Absolutely. I mean, I don't expect us to be chummy old pals after this, but the problem is that Elder Clarke's mind and his ideas and thoughts are destructive. I think they are they're not conducive to a good organization. I still feel like he's clinging on to a lot of homophobic, racist ideas that I just don't think should exist in any religion. And so come what may, with that, and it'll be what it'll be, but I think it was important enough to share. Yeah. So let's just summarize really quickly. This is really hard
one of the most conflicting things, there was a comment somewhere earlier where somebody basically said, haha, John, we caught you. You pulled these interviews because people threatened to take away their money. I want to be really clear about this. More people donated money because of these episodes than took money away. There was only like 2 people that canceled their donations, and there were like 4 or 5, I don't know how many people that started donations. This was clearly a net revenue benefit for Mormon Stories and the Open Stories Foundation. So if I were motivated purely by money, I would have kept up the old interviews. It was incredibly difficult to go back to our panelists, John Hamer, Lindsay Henson Park, Glenn Oslin, who had spent hours with us, not to mention Glenn spending hours of time editing for the Infants on Throne version. It was incredibly hard to go back to them and say, I'm pulling it, we're pulling it. It was hard to go back to all the listeners who were like, wait, I was listening, I love that, why'd you pull it? It was not because of money. This was a money winner for the Open Stories, not a money loser. So why did we pull it, Trevor? A lot of people are asking that. You know, you said it before, just say it again succinctly. Why did you decide, or what do you want to say about why you decided to pull this? You said it at the beginning, let's just say it at the end.
Right. Well, to clear up any legal implications, I from what I understand, I have every right in the state of Utah to record any conversation I'd like, and so
that you're a part of,
that I'm a part of,
yeah.
Right. And so in that sense, it was legal. I do understand the ethical question behind it. Obviously, because we've received a lot of messages from different people. And it was funny to see the 2 camps, right? Because it's always going to be under debate, because it was completely ethical to those that share the belief that the church is being dishonest. It needs to be more transparent because facts matter to us. But I'm starting to learn that they may not matter to everybody. Some people are not interested in that, and they want to believe, and they just want to have faith. And in that case, to those people, obviously this is an unethical thing to do. And so, but again, we don't want, I mean, my goal and John's goal is to be effective and really just share ideas in an open way that we would want, other people to share them with us. And if something, the means to an end, if that's going to be a stumbling block in us being able to share a story, then that's a real problem, and it makes us less effective. But yeah, as far as the ethical thing goes, that could be debated either way, left or right all day long.
Corinne asks, have you heard from Clarke or Grow since you released this audio? And you don't have to answer. If you don't want to answer, don't answer.
I will say directly no.
Okay. Corinne and others, Tyler, want to know how this has affected your family relationships. Do you want to talk about that, or do you want to not talk about that?
I'll talk about it generally. I'll just say this, that over the last few days, it's become a lot more apparent to me. It's just confirmed to me the fear that this religion does lean more into what you would call a cult than I was ever aware of. And you don't realize how hard it is to break away from it, or how tight the grasp is that they have on your life until you try to break free of it, or you try to talk about it openly. And yeah, I mean, obviously my entire family is completely LDS, just true believing, active members of the church. And I tried to do this in a third party way. I wasn't so much, trying to put it in their face, but obviously it gets back to them, and they didn't appreciate the way that, maybe I had gone about it, obviously. And so it's put some strain there, but nothing that we can't work out and work through, and with time, hopefully heal from. But this is, it's hurting families. It's tearing people apart that we can't talk about this kind of stuff. And the fact that none of my family actually listened to my story. I can't say none of them, but from my best understanding and the people I have talked to, nobody has actually listened to my story, listened to the recording, to actually even judge it for what it is. They've quickly jumped to conclusions, and it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate.
Melissa, my good friend Melissa from high school says, Trevor, you were supported and loved. Bethany writes, fear is the church's superpower. Brian writes, thanks again, Trevor, for doing this. It's been very helpful. I had the CS letter at the ready for difficult conversations. Now I can also reference the responses from Clarke and Grow. I'm glad I saved a copy. Must have been inspiration. Bethany talks about the role of whistleblowers. I want to invite listeners, if they have any final questions for Trevor, to go ahead and post them, because we're about to wrap up. Trevor, really quickly, one of the, in terms of why I pulled it down as well, I just want to say that it's a fair, on the one hand, it's this whistleblower question. On the one hand, journalists, someone sent me an excerpt from the journalist code that basically said something to the effect of, as a reporter, as a journalist, don't try and obtain information through gotcha journalism, through deception or other sorts of means, unless, and it's got this sort of clause, unless there's a problem where the people aren't forthcoming about the information, and when there's a compelling interest that the information gets told. And I don't know if that applies to this situation, but I like the spirit of that idea. If the first presidency, the apostles, if the Quorum of the 12, if they were out in public giving these answers, if they were recording their answers and sharing it with everybody, writing their name to the answers, addressing these things publicly, we wouldn't need to have private recordings. We wouldn't need, but they're not doing it. It's always private audience, behind closed doors, don't tell anybody, don't share it. And even with this recording, there's people who are like, well, what's the difference between sharing the recording and you've obviously listened to the recording and now you're going to be retelling it. And by the way, your retelling of it is unethical because you're misrepresenting what was said. Well, that's the catch-22, isn't it? Because if we would be allowed to release the recording, or if the brethren would release the recordings, then we wouldn't be able to take their statements out of context. But because they won't let us release the recordings, then now we can be dismissed and accused of taking all their words out of context. And which is it? Again, there needs to be consistency here. So just like the good people at Mormon Leaks say, they're all about transparency. And if the church would be more transparent and honest, there wouldn't be a need for people to be recording secret conversations. That's all true. And why did we pull it down? For me, in addition to the concerns that you shared with me privately, do we want to live in a world where everybody is scared that their private conversations are going to be recorded and posted on the internet? And that's a fair question. And I don't want Open Stories Foundation, Mormon Stories, me to be sort of perceived as this place that's unsafe. I can assure you this. I have hundreds of recordings that have been made of conversations with prophets, with apostles, 70 general authorities, bishops, stake presidents, apologists that I've never released. And I've never released them because the people who shared them with me asked me not to release them. And so I won't violate that. So, I don't believe in a by any means necessary approach. I think that we have the standard of not becoming the monsters that we've run from. And so we need to bring our best ethics. And so I thought about it, and I wish I had come to this conclusion before. I can't say I regret what we did, but I can say that I don't think the ends justified the means. I don't think in the net good that enough good came from it to justify the gray. And so, yeah, it's not a direct apology, but I think it was the right thing to pull it down. And I don't plan on sharing secretly recorded things in the future unless there's something so significant that I think it crosses that threshold of members absolutely needing to know. But if you're going to ask me in the future, I'm probably not going to be releasing private conversations behind closed doors of people just doing their best to answer questions, unless, again, there's some really severe, compelling need. Because maybe we don't all want to live in the world where we're worried about our private conversations being recorded and shared. Anything you want to say in response to that?
Well, John, I think, I mean, you pretty much nailed it on the head there. I just want to say, just kind of in conclusion, wrapping this up, is that, you know, the overall feeling that I got from this whole meeting was that, yes, we are open to truth, but facts don't matter at the same time. And so how can I live in a world where that makes sense? It just doesn't. And so sorry, but I can't like be sane and, you know, and accept that.
Yeah. And I would just add, I think the message they're saying is facts matter when they support the conclusions we want you to arrive at. Facts don't matter if they contradict the conclusions that we want you to arrive at.
Yeah,
and that's
not
better put. That's
right.
Not ethical. That's not consistent. Right. There's no integrity there. And I don't mean to be absolutist, but it's not a credible position. And that's why I think apologists are fraught. I think apologists are defending the indefensible, and they need to do it in a better way. And that's why I'm going to keep being hard on apologists until they stop doing that.
Well, I can't imagine anybody going into the meeting that I went into and coming out positive. Like, I can't imagine anybody coming out of that and being like, well, that was it. Like, I'm back in, you know, like, so the church really needs to start like assembling the, you know, like circling the wagons a little bit and getting on the same page with how they're going to respond to this, actually take these concerns seriously, decide, you know, to be transparent instead of dancing around issues and coming up with justifications. Keep your message consistent throughout, you know, and I mean, they've got to figure this out, John. I honestly believe that if they don't reform in some way, that over the next 15 years, with the internet and access to information, there's just going to be fewer and fewer people that are going to want to latch onto it. But even if they do reform it to match the culture or whatever, does that really mean now that it's true? You know what I mean? I've heard a lot of people say that, well, they got to be, you know, they've got to change the way they're thinking about that and this and that and the other, but it's kind of like the whole, you know, giving the blacks the priesthood, and as if we can't look at history, you know?
Yeah.
There's just certain things they can't undo.
A bunch of writers are writing in expressing love and gratitude to you, Trevor, for doing this. So lots of love coming from the comments. A lot of people are asking Trevor, what do you believe now? Do you know what you believe now? Have you replaced your beliefs? Do you want to share what your beliefs are now?
So I won't get too much into it because I'm still very fresh out of this whole experience. But what I will say is that unlike, you know, a lot of people that leave the church, I've clung on to my spirituality. I believe that I've had spiritual instances in my life. I decide to hang on to those. I'm not a religious person in any way, shape, or form. The LDS Church has opened my eyes to the dangers of religion, and as I've looked into it more, I just don't like the idea of religion. But spirituality is something that I'm having actually a lot of fun discovering. I feel like I'm like young again, you know, like I'm just now discovering myself. And whereas before I was religious, but I wasn't necessarily spiritual.
Right.
They don't always go hand in hand, you know?
Right.
So I'm opening my eyes to a lot of Eastern teachings, Buddhism, Hinduism, I love meditating and just opening up this channel between me and whatever that is.
Whatever's up there.
Whatever that is.
Brian asks if you're going to resign or if you have resigned. And if so, why or why not?
I'm sure that that's coming my way. And so it's kind of that decision time, whether, you know, I let them break up with me or I break up with them first. It's like I'm in junior high again. But yeah, I haven't made my decision there. But I would assume that, you know, within the next couple months, either I will have resigned or been excommunicated.
So there may be a disciplinary council in your future.
Yeah.
If that happens.
Yeah. Let's see if they allow me to bring a cell phone.
That's awesome. Joe says Trevor lunches on me sometime for doing these interviews. A lot of people just really appreciate it. Andrew asks a really good question. What about your personal and professional projects? Is there any way people who really see you as a light can support other work that you're doing now?
Oh, yeah. So that's a great question because I have a lot of plans for the future. You can check out what I do for a profession at haugencreative.com. That's
HAUGEN creative.com.
Yep. And you can see our creative work that we do. Film. You could see our film that we did that's centered around Buddhism called Jijivisha. And you can see some of the commercial work we do. But more on a personal note, I am compiling a lot of the stuff that I've talked about on this podcast as far as the videos that I'd made back last summer when I was first going through this. A lot of emotional videos going through this process, me ordering books, showing the different books that I was reading. I did a good job of kind of documenting that experience. So my next step is to come up with kind of a vlog about that, that will talk about my past experience with religion, my way out of Mormonism. And then I'm hoping to be able to share some ideas and explore spirituality with viewers like you on YouTube. So should be a fun adventure.
I love it. All right. So I want to just conclude by thanking you, Trevor. I mean, I think we went into this interview wondering, is it going to be interesting? Is it going to be relevant? You know, we already did a SmackDown, but I just want to tell you, number one, we had like 250 simultaneous viewers sustained for, a huge part of this conversation. This is one of the largest listening audiences Mormon Stories has ever had. If I go back and look right now, there's been 369 comments and 5.5 thousand views of today's discussion. I think that what I love about this is that we let Lindsay and Glenn and John Hamer do the SmackDown, but I think what this shows, and by the way, it's 5.9 thousand views now, 372 comments. What this shows, Trevor, is how thoughtful and intelligent you are, and how sincere you are. So I think it's a huge win that we went back and did this recording. I know that people loved it. We've got so many likes and comments and views and shares. This was a huge success.
All I'm doing is asking questions that people should ask. And honestly, I just want people to know that at the end of this, I don't care if people decide to stay in the church or not. That is not my intent. I don't think it's your intent, John. Our intention is not to convince anyone, to persuade anyone, but I believe that people deserve to know the information. I believe that people should be given everything and then from there be able to make an educated decision based on information and spiritual guidance.
100%. No one believes this if they're a believer, but my goal is not to lead people away from the Church or Mormonism. If I could wave my magic wand, everyone could download from a database all the facts and all the evidence about Mormonism and its truth claims. And if then they decided that they wanted to continue engaging in Mormonism, then bless them.
Great.
But I think everybody deserves the right to know all the evidence, all the facts, all the harm caused by the church, and then make an informed decision. And there's a lot of good the church does. There's a lot of good teachings in the church. None of us are saying there aren't good teachings, there aren't good people, there aren't good leaders. and there are good things about the church. None of us are saying that. We're not saying don't be a Mormon or leave the church. What we are saying is inform yourself not only of the history and the facts and the doctrine, inform yourself of the harm that the church does to LGBT people, to women, to people of color, to families, to doubters. And if you then decide you want to remain, remain. Bless you.
And we're saying that not all truth and all, everything good that exists in this world can only be found in the LDS church.
Yeah, there's good everywhere. And don't stay in the church because you're scared that you can't be happy or that your kids are going to be messed up.
Yes.
Hundreds of thousands of children of active Mormons are messed up. I tell you that as somebody who was a psychologist at a university counseling center that was 80% Mormon for 6 years, if you count all the work that I did at Utah State University. I still talk to children of active Mormons all the time. You do not have a guarantee that your children are going to be awesome by remaining active. There are good children in Mormonism, good children out of Mormonism. There are messed up children in Mormonism, messed up children out of Mormonism. There's divorce in Mormonism, divorce out of Mormonism. Do not let the fear that the church gives you rule your life.
Yeah, if there was one takeaway, I think, for people is to replace that fear with excitement. There's so much to discover out there and to explore, man. And it's so fun. Every day is just so fun, because you can learn something new and decide whether you want to make that a part of your life. Whether does that teaching or does that idea help me be a greater version of myself? You know what I mean? Instead of restricting your ideas into one. So that would be my big takeaway is if you are scared, if you are feeling this fear, anxiety of being who deep inside you really want to be, just know that very quickly that's replaced with fun, excitement, and just
agree.
Yeah, just awesome stuff.
A quick shout out to everyone who joined us today. I just noticed Hans and Brigitte Matzen spend their evening in Spain or Sweden, wherever they are. Shout out to the Matzens. We love you guys.
Way.
Yeah,
Wow.
shout out to everyone who joined us today. Steve Holbrook, Jerry Lee Renshaw, Tina Prince, Melissa Wells, all my old friends, Heath Hendrickson, current friends. Just love you guys for joining us. Want to thank Trevor for your courage. Want to thank Lindsay Hanson Park, John Hamer, and Glenn Osland for their participation in the series that we took down. I want to thank Matt Groh and Don Clark for their kindness and generosity and being willing to meet with you. Of course, they're not going to love how we talked about that meeting, but I think they deserve credit for trying to show you love and support. And we need to thank them for that. And thank any church leader that tries to give thoughtful, loving, responsible support to members who doubt and question. Hopefully, this will help educate the church on how to train their prophets, apostles, 70 quorum members, stake presidents, and bishops on how not to talk to doubters and on how to talk to doubters. And I guarantee they're paying attention, and I guarantee that this is going to help improve how they deal with doubters in the future. Finally, I just want to thank the Open Stories Foundation Board of Directors that makes all this possible. I want to thank Amy Shoemaker Grubbs, who's my Director of Operations. I want to thank all of those who make this possible. And most importantly, I want to thank the donors. Those of you who donate to the Open Stories Foundation, to Mormon Stories, to A Thoughtful Faith, to Mormon Matters, to Mormon Transitions, your donations pay for the mission of the Open Stories Foundation, which makes everything we do possible. So please, if you've benefited from this, if you like it, if you want to see it continue, your tax deductions your donations are tax deductible. They will go to good use. We're transparent in our finances. Please donate to Mormon Stories and the Open Stories Foundation, PayPal, donor box, however you want to do it. Write us a letter, send a check. We will use your donations responsibly. We will be transparent in how we handle your donations, and we will continue supporting people in transition, supporting progressive Mormons, post-Mormons, and helping the church get better indirectly. That's not our goal, but that's the result. So with that, Trevor Haugen, love you.
Love you, John.
Thanks for
John.
coming, brother.
Appreciate it.
Thanks to all our listeners. And please join us again soon for another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care, everybody. This was super fun.
See you guys.
Publicly, he would malign them as whores in the newspaper. And then, of course, when William Law tells the world, I was in the first presidency, Joseph's lying about polygamy, I saw him practicing polygamy, I know he's doing it, then Joseph calls him a liar and destroys the printing press and tries to destroy all the evidence that was made. How can Grow or anyone say, oh my gosh, I think Joseph, he was a good man. The more I read about Joseph Smith, the more I love him. Those are the acts of a charlatan. Those are the acts of somebody who is predatory and abusing their power. And I was really sad. There were probably 2 people that canceled, their donations to Mormon Stories as a result of our previous episodes. More people gave money than took money away. So none of our decisions were about the money. But I did think to myself, for the people that canceled their donations, I thought, interesting, you'll give 10% of your income to a church whose prophet has done all these heinous things, including abusing children, lying to their wife, embezzling people's money. You'll keep giving 10% to that organization that has policies that cause young LGBT Mormons to kill themselves and that actually causes marriages to unravel and children to be torn from their parents. You'll keep donating to that organization. But if on Mormon Stories we share the recording of a general authority, you'll cancel your donations because that's beyond the pale. I just kind of question the values and the priorities of the people that would make that decision.
John, did you see what was happening when we were talking about Joseph Smith's character, right? And how they're so quick to justify everything he's done, but never with Jeremy Runnels, right?
Yeah.
And how can they look at this as okay? I just don't understand it. The magnifying glass that they're putting these people under. I mean, you would think that you would need a more powerful magnifying glass when you're talking about a prophet.
Yeah.
But they let these things slide and they justify things like, well, we don't know if, really, if the polyandrous marriages were sexual in nature, right? We don't know that. And it's like, well, I never really write down in my journal, like, man, had some great sex last night, that's not something that's really talked about. I mean, so yeah, we don't know these things, but the fact that they were going on and with very young girls, that's the problem, is that this is ruining people's lives. This is a great point, because stuff like this still happens today, and he uses an example where he says, well, there's a story of a man, he was 31, back in 1840, and he marries a 15-year-old girl. And although maybe some eyebrows were raised or whatever, it was a fine thing to happen, because back then it was a different time. Well, first of all, it was still a big deal, okay, to marry somebody that's that young. But the biggest difference between that story and a Joseph Smith story is that they fell in love, and they both consensually decided to get married out of love.
And it wasn't illegal.
And right. And
it
Joseph
wasn't coercive.
Smith, right. It wasn't divisive. Joseph Smith, on the
Okay, the final point that you included in your letter was about polygamy and polyandry. Why don't you go ahead and talk to us about what points you were making there?
Well, Joseph Smith had at least 34 wives. But what really, and I I always thought that Joseph Smith may have practiced polygamy. I mean, I knew it was a big thing with Brigham Young and a few prophets after that, but I didn't know how big it was with Joseph Smith. And so as I started looking into it and realizing that he had that many polygamous wives, and then seeing him constantly covering it up and lying about it, it wasn't something that he was owning, and so that was a red flag for me. But probably the biggest thing was when I learned about polyandry. I had never even heard of that word before. I'd never heard it spoken in church. And I actually had to look up the definition, but what it is a man that marries another man's wife. And so Joseph Smith had 11, I believe, polyandrous marriages as well. And several of those were to priesthood holding men. And so when I was a missionary, I would talk about polygamy, very quickly, dismiss it, say it's not something we, practice anymore. It was something that we were using in the beginning of the church because of persecution. We needed to really quickly be able to populate an area, or it was to help out, elderly women, and maybe even people that never got married, help them with a sealing ordinance. That was my always thing. But how am I supposed to justify the polyandry? Like, how could I ever explain to somebody the purpose for that?
Yeah. Yeah. And so Grove's response, he basically kind of pulls his church historian, Joseph Smith Papers Project card. He basically, oversaw the creation of the essays and the editorial process. He oversees the Joseph Smith Papers Project. And he says to you, and I believe he's sincere, right? But
right.
He basically, and it was kind of sweet. He basically said, I've spent the last 6 years reading pretty much everything that Joseph Smith ever wrote. And I've come to, you say you've come to detest him, or whatever word it was you used to say, you just stopped liking Joseph Smith, basically. You saw him in a bad light. Basically, Grove says, the more I read about Joseph, the more I come to like him better. So that was what did you think about that?
Well, thinking about it after, it kind of made sense to me, actually, because I've been studying so much on Joseph Smith's life and his actions, right? And where Matt is talking about his writings. So I think we're talking about two different things. I had always looked at Joseph Smith's writings. And so, of course, I praised the man. Everything he said was beautiful and brilliant and happy and good. But when I actually started looking at him as a person, his actions, what he was actually doing, that's when his character was defiled to me. And so we were kind of talking about two different things, I think.
Right. Not his writings, but his behavior.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I mean, Joseph Smith deceived people about treasure digging. He deceived people about the Kirtland Bank and people lost their fortunes. He deceived people about translating ancient records. He lied to his own wife that he was practicing polygamy, and he hid it from her, which violates the text of D&C 132, by the way, because the wife is supposed to be able to approve any subsequent wives that get taken.
Well, yeah, and D&C 132-63 goes especially against polyandry.
Yeah, and he's taking on other people's wives. He's sending people on missions and then propositioning their wives while the men are away on missions that he sent them on. And then he's actually propositioning 14, 15, 16-year-olds with this massive abuse of power that's predatory, inappropriate for young girls. Any of us by any standard today would kill or throw someone in jail for doing the types of things to our daughters that Joseph Smith did to other people's daughters. And then he would threaten them. He would say, I'll coerce you. If you become my plural wife, then you and your whole family will be sealed in the celestial kingdom with me. But if you do not accept plural marriage with me, you and all your family will be condemned. And then if any possible plural wife disagreed to be Joseph's plural wife, then he would actually, and spoke about it